So in this section, let's talk a little bit about debugging, what we can do to get the application running, and then to examine the state of that, especially in terms of troubleshooting. What can we do to get a better view of the application? So we talked a little bit about clicking the Start Debugging menu option or pressing F5. Let's look at the Build menu. We can build the application. We can publish the application. We're not ready to do that. Publishing is something that will be covered in a different session. There's also a lot of options for debugging, not only starting the debugger, but the fact that you can step into and step over statements. We'll talk about how to go through that in just a moment. And then the toolbar here has some of the options as well for stepping into, stepping over, stepping out, and the ability to stop and break the debugging. So if you're used to debugging in Visual Basic 6, you should be in pretty familiar territory with debugging in Visual Basic 2005. Now when you do a build, it actually does create an exe. Visual Basic code, when it's compiled, ends up in .NET Intermediate Language called IL or MSIL for Microsoft Intermediate Language. And this is what's executed by the .NET framework. And whether you write your code in C# or in Visual Basic, the really cool thing is your code is all the same in the end. There's no difference, there's no penalty for Visual Basic versus C#. There's a strong preference, of course, from some people for which environment you want to use, but in the end, it's all .NET managed code. It doesn't make a difference. Your code is .NET code in the end. So let's save the project so that we can take a look at the files. Similar to Visual Basic 6, if you don't save the project, you can still work with it. Right now, in order for us to take a look at it, though, we need to save it to disk. And to be clear, it does actually save it. It's a temporary location where it puts the files until you're ready to save them. So actually, this is in some ways better than the model in VB6. If you actually did have a crash in the IDE, you could recover those files. So now we can see the Exploring VB project is within the Visual Studio 2005 projects folder. Our solution is here. As if you remember, the solution is the overall container for one or more projects. We don't see an entry for the solution here. If we did, it would just be one level higher than the project. So then the project itself is Exploring VB, and the VB proj is the project file that contains the information for what files are in this project, how it will compile, that sort of thing. And then when we build the project, or if we start debugging, it causes a build, and it goes to the bin debug or bin release folder, depending on whether we are in debug or release mode. When you're in debug mode, it causes some additional information to be saved out. And the debugger uses this so that you can do things like edit and continue, or when you pause, it jumps to the right line in the code. You can't do that if you're not in debug mode. Most of these files you probably don't need to care about. PDB has to do with the debugger. The VS host files have to do with the Visual Studio process itself when you're debugging. The config file contains settings related to your application. Actually, we added a setting for the text box, and so that's going to be contained in this file. This is XML. This is human readable. And then the exe itself, we could just double-click that, and it would launch the application. Let's hide the toolbox again. In Visual Basic 6, you probably did a lot with debugging your projects. There was a combination of what did you do with just stepping through, and then you may have also worked with the debug.print statement. Debug.print is still around. We'll debug.print the value of the text box. Now notice I've got parentheses here. Even when you're calling subs and there's no function, there's no value being returned, Visual Basic 2005, you do always need to include the parentheses, even if there's no arguments and even if there's no value being returned. It looks like a subtle thing, but you will have a problem. The compiler will see, without the parentheses, it will see the word as a property rather than as a method. So it's very important to make sure you include the parentheses every time. So the debug.print statement will spit out to the immediate window. And the immediate window is useful, as it was in Visual Basic 6, just for printing out quick and dirty evaluations of statements to see how they run. Good for quick testing sometimes. It's not quite as easy to use in some ways because of the fact that Visual Basic 2005 is so much more object-oriented. And because everything is in an object, you have to create an object before you can invoke the methods on it in general. And so there's a lot of, there's not quite as much you can do in the immediate window in order to test your objects. But that said, it is still useful, and when you're running your project, when you're debugging, anything that you spit out using debug.print will go down into the immediate window. Let's clear that out. The other option you have instead of a debug.print, if you want to get some kind of output, is to write to the console, and typically that's the DOS prompt where you started your application from. So I'm going to do a demonstration with both the debug.print, which goes to the immediate window, and then the console.write line. And this goes to the output window. I can switch back and forth. Notice how those open by default down in here. I do have the ability, if I start to drag it, I have an incredible amount of flexibility as to where it's going to put the pane when I drop it. This is a wonderful new feature with 2005. Gives you quite a lot of control as to how the panes will be dropped down. So I have it down in the lower portion of this overall region, and the immediate window and output are side by side. If I use the tabs, I can switch between them. So anytime I print to the console, if I'm not running from a DOS prompt, there's no place for it to go. So within the debugger, it will spit it to the output window. And so keep this in mind. It could be a little confusing. If you have some places in your code where you're doing a debug.print and other places where it's a console.write line, just keep that distinction in mind. Your debug.print goes to the immediate window. Your console.write line goes to the output window. So let's take a look at that and see what that looks like. We'll start the application. Oh, and actually, another point to keep in mind, notice the output window disappeared. The immediate window came back. Visual Studio 2005 keeps track of what panes are showing, whether you're in debugging view or editing view. And since we just changed to the debugging view, it rearranged the panes accordingly. Notice the toolbar is gone as well. Now I can make the toolbar come back if I want to. Of course, it doesn't have a lot of purpose if I'm in debugging mode. So it's a real nice way to rearrange the interface however you want to see it. See, I've got a few other options right now for Windows as well that are only relevant when I'm in debugging mode. Visual Basic 6 tends to show a lot of options and then just gray them out when they're not available. But Visual Studio 2005 won't even show them if they don't make any sense in the context. So I'm back to having the immediate window and output window down here. If you remember, when I click echo, it spits it out. And I told it to debug.print what's in the message box, and it did, and that shows in the immediate window. And console.write line the word console. We don't see it, but if we switch over to the output window, there it is. I'm going to stop the debugging and demonstrate that we have a few other options with the debug. We've got assert and print, which you may have noticed in VB6. Those are the same options we had. That's not it, though. We've got quite a few other options. And what I want to do here is demonstrate how you can indent. And then when I print out, we'll see that it is jutting out a little bit. And then we can unindent. And I could also indent several times if I wanted to. So each time I indent, it's going to push it out a little bit more. And then each time I unindent, it's going to bring it back a little bit more. So let's clear the output and the immediate window and start again. And the console, again, this hasn't changed. I didn't do anything to the console.write line. But if we look in the immediate window, it first spit out the message text box. I called indent and then wrote the word indented, and notice it is indeed indented out from the other information. And when I unindent, it brings it back over here. So this is really nice. If you're writing code where you have a few different loops you go into, you might want to indent a certain section to say within the loop, maybe these are the entries in the loop. So you want to see those indented from the rest. But then maybe within that loop, you may sometimes want to spit out some additional details on an object in the collection. So you could then indent that even further. So then when you go back later and you're trying to find things in your debugging log, it might be easier to sort things out by having everything indented and outdented, have everything more consistent that way. Now I'm going to actually put a breakpoint in here, and has no effect at this point. The code's not doing anything right now. The window's just sitting there. But if I click the echo button, it's going to enter the click event handler. It's going to call save, And then before it executes the debug.print line, because I've set a breakpoint, it's going to stop. I'm going to click echo. And now the line is highlighted in yellow. Now this gives me the ability to, just like in Visual Basic 6, make any kind of change I want to. Let's copy this whole block. And let's go down and clear out the window from last time. Let's set another breakpoint down here before we show the message box. If I press the continue button, it's going to jump down until it hits either the next breakpoint or it would just continue on executing the application. So notice now it spit out the word, it indented again, and then unindent brought it back to here. And it's about to show the message box, but actually I don't want it to do that quite yet. Let me drag back up to here, and I've just changed the execution so that now the next line is going to be here. Before I do that, let's demonstrate one other thing. You may have noticed a problem here. I just indented twice and I unindented once. Now I need to change the indent level, and notice I could change how much it indents. The indent size would let me set how many spaces it's going to indent, or I can just explicitly set the indent level. And why don't I set it to 0 to reset things so that when this runs each time, I don't keep jutting out one more every time it runs. So we're going to drag it up one level. Notice that line of code wasn't even there before. And now I'm still, even though I just added it while I'm paused, I'm still able to drag the yellow line up to there. So let's hit the play button again. And it ran to one line here. Let's drag it, or let it run down to the next breakpoint. And as you can see, it did reset the indentation so that both times the word default is all the way over to the left. So you may have heard earlier on when Visual Studio.net first came out, the 2002 version, Edit and Continue was really immature. It really wasn't doing what Visual Basic 5 and 6 and all the generations of Visual Basic, people just took it for granted. You could pause, you could edit, you could continue. It was this very powerful feature, and we just kind of lost it a bit. And it's really come back in force. It actually also works in C# and a number of other managed languages, but it works very well in Visual Basic. You can hit the pause button, you can make any changes to your code, and it's just right there. You don't have to rebuild it, you don't have to restart it. You can drag that yellow arrow, you can play through your statements again. It gives you complete control as you're running the application to make the changes you need to make. And when I let it go through, it shows that message box again. Now the last thing I want to do in this section, let's pause the code again. And let's make a change. We'll take out the breakpoints. We don't really need them here. But let's see some other options that we have with the message box. If you look here, this 1 of 21 tells me I've actually got 21 different ways I can call messagebox.show. Don't try to count them. Don't try to worry about what all the different options are. We don't need all of them. But let's take advantage of the fact that we can set a few other parameters here. Message textbox.text is the message that we're going to show. The second option, if we start with a string, that's going to be interpreted as the text. Let's set the caption for the window as well. And the caption, of course, is the title. And then let's set, instead of an OK, let's put an OK and a cancel button up there. And finally, let's use the, let's say, the hand. You can choose anything you want to there. Let's start the application up again, or resume the application. It had never actually stopped, it was just paused. If we click echo now, we get the big red X, we have a caption up here, and we only have an OK and a cancel button. So the message box, if you're used to MSGbox from VB6, you can still use it, but you'll be missing out on a lot of functionality. I should also point out, there's a lot of the functions in VB6 that are available. Things like strcmp or len, a lot of the functions that you would use that did not require invoking them on an object itself. They were just kind of built-in functions, and MSG box, message box was like that. If you continue to use those, your code will still work, but it may be a little bit less straightforward to maybe other team developers that are working in C# or another managed language. And it does hamper things a little bit. It requires that compatibility level then of the VB6. It is supported, but it is definitely recommended that you move to the Visual Basic 2005 functions. So if you're converting code over, it kind of does give you that ability to go gently, bring it over as it is. Most of it will work out of the box, but it's definitely better to go back through and try to take advantage of some of these additional features.